And one starter coming right up. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is turn my attention to the accessories. This is a horizontally mounted engine, so I'm most likely going to need to make some clearance between the front of the engine here and the firewall. There's not much room on these horizontally mounted. It's much easier with a longitudinally mounted engine, and usually on those I'll leave pretty much all the accessories on if it's longitudinally mounted, because you've got a lot more room between the front of the engine and when you remove the radiator, the front of the car, there's going to be like 1.5 feet of room. But here I've only got like maybe 4 inches of room to work with, so I'm going to have to create some space on the front of the engine. Now, regardless of what accessories you decide to keep or remove, there's 2 accessories that you're going to want to leave behind in the engine compartment and not disconnect from the vehicle itself. One of them is going to be this, the air compressor, and the other one is going to be this, the power steering pump. So what I usually like to do is disconnect those from the engine and then tie them off somewhere and not disconnect them. It's just a lot easier that way. This air conditioner, probably I actually could disconnect the lines, because I think the last time this air conditioner worked was during a time when America actually thought Jim Carrey was funny. So I'm pretty safe, I think, removing these lines, but in general, don't remove these air conditioner lines, not to mention it's illegal. So just disconnect the AC from the bracket to the engine and just set it out of the way, and do the same thing with the power steering pump. Try to keep the power steering pump upright though as much as possible when you tie it out of the way. And I've also got some accessory drive belts here. There's 3 of them on this model, and one goes in front of the other, so I've labeled the order that the belts go in, so that I don't have 3 belts that I've got to figure out which order they all go. And there are 3 bolts that hold the power assembly in line, and you see they are all of different sizes. So you can either label them up with tape, or in this case, what I'm going to do is actually thread the parts back in where they came into the pump now that it's out of the engine, and that'll also help me keep the orientation right. And then this pump I'm going to find a home for out of the way of the engine. So as long as I'm removing the accessories, one thing I do remember from my removal of the salvage engine is there is not enough clearance between the fender and the harmonic balancer. When I remove the engine, the balancer is going to jam up against the fender. So this harmonic balancer needs to be removed. Now, there's a couple things to know about this if you're not familiar with removing a harmonic balancer. First of all, turning this bolt obviously is going to turn over the engine, and you have to freeze the harmonic balancer in place, but this bolt is usually very, very, very tight. Now I'm going to use an impact gun to remove this, but I know a lot of you don't have impact guns. There's these 2 holes here on this model, and there's a special tool that you use to plug into these holes, and it's got a long handle, and you jam it up against the frame or something to lock the harmonic balancer in place. And then other models, this is just a push-on model, or slip fit model. So when I remove this bolt, I'm going to be able to just walk this harmonic balancer off with my hands, maybe with a gentle tap of a hammer or something. But a lot of times harmonic balancers are pressed on, and you're going to need to get a harmonic balancer removal tool. Don't use a 3-jaw pulley or something like that. You'll break the edges of the balancer. There's a special tool that you would use called a harmonic balancer removal tool for most models in order to get the press fit harmonic balancer off of the crankshaft. So make sure you use the right tools for this. You don't want to damage this harmonic balancer, because otherwise your engine is going to run with a lot of vibration. All right, and again, I should be able to just walk this off using just my hands. There it goes, and you see there's actually a keyway there. So this only fits on one way, so I don't have to worry about orientation. And what I want to do is thread this in, because we are going to have to turn over the engine by hand in order to access the bolts for the drive plate to torque converter. So we'll put that back in, and now I should have enough clearance to pull the engine from the transmission without jamming up against the firewall. Now, one other note on this harmonic balancer here, and that is when you go to install it, again, this one's going to be easy because I'm just going to press it into place and then I'm going to torque that bolt down. But it's probably going to occur to you that you could just use the crankshaft bolt to push in your harmonic balancer if you have a press fit harmonic balancer. Certainly by no means should you hammer on the harmonic balancer if it's press fit to get it back onto the crankshaft. So it may occur to you to use the crankshaft bolt to pull the harmonic balancer back onto the hub. Don't do that, trust me. These crankshaft bolts are not made for that kind of purpose, and when you strip out the threads inside your crankshaft, this project is going to turn into a really, really suck day. So your harmonic balancer removal tool will also include a harmonic balancer installer, and use the installer tool to press fit on your harmonic balancer if that's what you need for your model. Don't use the crankshaft bolt to try to do that. That's probably going to end up as a disaster. So keep that in mind as well. And while we're on the topic of special tools, this high pressure fuel line right here just bolts right in to the fuel rail. By the way, pay attention to the washers here, and these are copper washers, so anytime you see copper compression washers like that, you're going to want to replace them. So I'm just going to thread that back in. Let's keep it in place. But a lot of models are not like this. If you especially are working on American models, typically your fuel lines have quick connect fittings. And with quick connect fittings, you're going to need a very special basic tool set. It's a bunch of these little discs that you would fit onto the fuel line and use it to push into the quick connect fitting to spread it out, and then you can pull apart your lines. So you'll run into that situation on a lot of especially American models. But on this model, it's very simple. It just bolts in with this banjo bolt here. So make sure that you've got your, again, right tool set for your application. And another thing to be aware of, and I couldn't find a good example on this particular model, but usually on older cars, especially from the 80s and 90s, you'll run into this. You'll often see when you're labeling up your vacuum tubes that a lot of the tubes converge into a kind of tree, a vacuum tree. And the tree looks like it's just a connection for all these vacuum tubes, and it wouldn't matter where the tubes connect onto that vacuum tree. They all look pretty much the same, like it's just a big central vacuum source. But be careful with those. Do take your notes, like I was saying, and be very methodical with where each tube goes on such trees like that. The reason being because a lot of times those are not just simply central vacuum ports that disperse vacuum to all those tubes. They're actually mechanically operated switches called CTOSs, or coolant temperature operated switches. And the idea with some of those is that as the coolant heats up, the different tubes on there may or may not be activated. So by switching those tubes around, you may activate some components, say the EGR valve or something, when the engine isn't warmed up because you've got the hoses in the wrong place. So you definitely want to make sure when you see those vacuum trees that you're putting those hoses exactly back where they came from in case you've got some type of mechanically operated switch like that. So always keep that in mind. My next focus is going to be, I want to get to the bolts that connect the drive plate to the torque converter. So the first thing, this exhaust pipe's in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the exhaust. Really good tip, the day before you do your project, if you can, hit these bolts anywhere on the exhaust with some penetrating oil, and that will help to remove them. I didn't have a chance to do that, so hopefully these will come out reasonably well. Nope, those are pretty tight, so I'm going to have to get the impact gun because I'm kind of afraid of breaking those. All right, I've got my exhaust pipe tied out of the way, and I can see the plate that I want to get to, which is, let's see if you can see my finger right here. It's behind an engine mount though, so I'm going to have to remove this engine mount, and then if I remove that plate, this plate is on the engine side. When I remove that plate, I'll be able to access the bolts that secure the drive plate to the torque converter, and that's where I want to get to. So let's get this engine mount out of the way first. And incidentally, if you've got an automatic transmission, all models are going to have either some type of plate that you're going to have to remove to access those bolts, or in some cases removing the starter allows you to access those bolts at the drive plate. But this one does have this little cover plate like most models do, so I need to get that off before I can go much further. And incidentally, I was looking for the connector for the oxygen sensor, and I finally found it, and check this out. It completely melted away. Obviously somebody had this routed along the exhaust pipe, and this thing is completely melted. It looks like somebody held a torch to it. So again, one of the reasons why you want to make sure you don't route your wiring or hoses along exhaust manifolds right there. I used a jack under the transmission pan to slightly lift the transmission so that I can get that transmission mount out. You don't want to be removing mounts unless you're supporting that component. And now with that engine mount out of the way, we can see this cover here, and this is a little weird because usually these are bolted on, but this is just a pressed on plastic cover, and there we go. So what we're looking at here is, we can see this here is the drive plate, and then behind it here is the torque converter. And in fact, we can see up in the corner here, maybe there's one of those bolts. So I'll need to turn the crankshaft to bring this bolt around. But before I do that, there's something that I want to do. What I'm going to do is get some paint here, and I'm going to make a paint mark on the torque converter and on the drive plate. And the reason I'm doing this is because sometimes these are balanced, and I want to be able to line up the drive plate with the torque converter in the same way on the reinstallation, because if it's out of balance, it's going to cause some vibration. And I think there's like 8 bolts that hold this one in. It's weird. Usually there's only 4 or maybe 6. This is hardly a high performance engine. I'm not sure why there's 8 bolts that hold this in. And since I'll be turning the engine over with just one hand, I'm going to make it easier on myself by loosening these spark plugs so that there won't be any compression in the cylinders. This next part that I'm going to do is way easier with 2 people, and I'm by myself here because it's getting on like 9:30 at night, and don't want to bother my neighbors too much. So we're going to try to get this thing out of here tonight, and then we'll continue tomorrow with the reinstallation. And what I'm going to do is get a socket onto that thing, and it's going to be a little bit hard to do while holding the camera, but when I turn that bolt, again, the crankshaft's going to want to move, so I'll have to hold my ratchet on my crankshaft in place while I loosen that bolt for the drive plate to torque converter. All right, there goes the first one, and then we'll turn until the second one. There's the second one, and I'm just going to keep repeating this until I get them all out. Now, it may occur to you, or you may have a situation where you cannot do this because the engine is locked. And if the engine is locked, you've got a couple of possibilities, which I will talk about. I will tell you what, this is actually really hard work, and filming it makes it all the more difficult. This is definitely the last time I ever filmed doing an engine install. It is hot. You get all dirty and everything, and man, this is actually a lot of labor, so you definitely want to prepare for that if you're going to take on a project like this. And one thing that will make this project a lot harder is if your engine is locked up. So what do you do in that situation? How are you going to get those torque converter bolts out? So there's a couple ways you can do it. One of them, and you won't be able to do it on this engine, is if you have a longitudinally mounted engine, that is with the crankshaft facing the front of the car and the transmission behind, like under the dashboard, that's a longitudinal mount, you should have enough room that you can actually remove the engine with the torque converter still bolted up to the drive plate. And you don't necessarily need a rear-wheel drive model to have a longitudinal mount. I know I've done Intrepids with 3.3 liter, 3.5 liter, and the 2.7 liter engines, and you can definitely take those out. Incidentally, if you've got a 2.7 liter engine in your Intrepid, you're going to want to save this video because you're probably going to be doing this pretty soon. But that's one way you can actually take the torque converter out with the engine. Now, on this model, and on any horizontal mount model, you're not going to be able to do that. So you've got a couple options. The one that I like to do, if I can remove the oil pan, I'll remove the oil pan, and it's messy. This is not really a great thing to do. But what you want to do is remove the oil pan and then loosen all of the main caps and the rod caps so that you'll eventually free up the engine and you'll be able to rotate. So that's a preferred method, but again, it's pretty messy being under the car doing that with oil dripping in your face. The other method that you can do is to remove the engine and the transmission together. But if at all possible, I like to keep the transmission in the car. It really is difficult because of the weight and everything to line everything up when you've got an engine and transmission together if you're by yourself. So you might want to plan ahead for that, but those are your options if you've got a frozen engine. Luckily, I don't seem to have that situation here, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove the rest of those torque converter bolts, and then after that we remove the engine mounts and then the engine to transmission bolts, and we are going to pluck this thing out of here. So let's get back to work. But I need a drink first. All right, that's it for my engine to transmission bolts. There were actually 6 of them. I think earlier I said there were 8, but there's actually 6. Admittedly, I'm starting to get a little tired here. So one of the things I wanted to show is you see my paint marks came back around, and now when I turn the crankshaft, you'll see that the flywheel moves, I'm sorry, the drive plate in this case, flywheel would be for a clutch. The drive plate moves independently of the torque converter now. So it's possible to line up, I just passed it right there, it's possible to line up the bolt holes in a different sequence than what we had earlier. And again, that's why I made the paint marks on both the drive plate and the torque converter so that I can maintain that same orientation when I reinstall it. So I hope that makes sense now. And my bolts go into their little space in the bucket. We're getting kind of near the end of the bucket, which means we're getting near the end of anything connecting this transmission and engine together, so we're getting pretty close now. Well, that should do it for all the work that I need to do under the car, which is fine with me. Believe it or not, I actually hate getting dirty. This is not really totally my thing. I'd much rather have a check engine light than do something like this, but I know there's a lot of guys that love to get all greasy and everything like that. I'm kind of a princess. So what I want to do now is access all of the engine to transmission bolts and loosen those up. But before I do that, there's a couple of things I want to do. There's only 2 things that are holding this engine in place right now that I know of. I may find that not to be the case when I start pulling it. One of them is the rest of the engine mounts, and the other one, again, the engine to transmission bolts. So what I want to do is I want to get a jack and put it under the oil pan and support the engine right now, because I don't want to have the engine unsupported when I remove the mounts and the engine to transmission bolts. The other thing is when I actually pull the engine, I want to make sure that I have a jack underneath the transmission. The engine is the support for the transmission as well, and if I remove the engine without supporting the tranny, what's going to happen is the tranny is going to be resting on maybe 1 or 2 mounts and put a lot of stress on them and possibly break them. So I think what I'm going to do at this point is when I remove the engine to transmission bolts, there's actually going to be 2 alignment dowels that will still hold the engine and transmission together. So I'm not too worried about removing the last engine to transmission bolt and having the engine fall on the floor or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and try to remove those. And now with everything out of the way and this wiring harness all pulled away and everything, we should be able to do that pretty easily. I'm going to go ahead and remove the engine to transmission bolts now. And the reason I'm doing this before I remove the engine mounts is because if I remove the engine mounts, the engine's going to be kind of wobbly in there, and those engine to tranny bolts are actually pretty tight. So I don't want to put undue stress on the mounts for the transmission by yanking on those bolts. So while the engine and transmission are nice and secure, this is a good time to remove those bolts. Now here's one right here, and this one I'm just going to break loose right now, but I'm not going to remove it. And that's just to hold the engine and transmission together until I want to separate them, and then I can just remove this bolt very easily. Again, there's alignment dowels that will hold the engine and transmission together, so it's not that critical to do it, but I'm just doing that as a safeguard. The next one, sometimes you just kind of have to feel for these, but the next one is right here underneath this cover, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that one next. All right, there's our first engine to transmission bolt right there. Really good idea is to take this to the hardware store and get one of these that's about twice as long with the same thread and pitch, and make sure they're grade 8 bolts. And if you get 4 grade 8 bolts that are longer than these, you'll be able to use them in your engine stand if you have one. And I really like putting the engine on the engine stand. It's much easier to work on than, I think, safer than have it dangling from your cherry picker. I said dangling from your cherry picker. All right, I'm going to position my jack with a block of wood on it so I don't pop it through the oil pan. And I'm just going to set it under the oil pan and lift the oil pan just a tad. And that'll allow me to get the engine mount bolts out. All right, so there's the bolt and nut set for the first engine mount. The engine mounts on this model are really easy to reach, by the way. That makes things a lot easier. Actually, this is probably the easiest engine pull I've ever done. So whenever you work with economy cars, you generally find that you have smaller engines and less accessories, so it does make this job a lot easier. On later model cars with a V8, boy, this could be a whole weekend just pulling this engine. And on the second engine mount, there. And if you have trouble getting these bolts out from the engine mount, then one of the things you might try doing is lifting or lowering your jack so that you take pressure off the engine mount, and that'll allow the bolts to just slide right out. Same thing when you install these bolts back in. Once you got everything lined up, support the engine with the jack, and just raising or lowering the jack just 1/4 of an inch may make the difference whether these things slide in or not. I said make a difference whether it slides in or not. That sounds dirty. All right, remember this last guy. This is our last engine to transmission bolt. So this should come out pretty easy because remember I broke it loose before. And now the only thing that should be holding this engine and transmission together would be the alignment dowels. And when I take this bolt out, we should start seeing, and we can see it here. I'll give you a little view of this. All right, you can see that a gap is forming between the engine and transmission. You can actually, if I could do this without being in the way, you can actually see the bolt threaded through right there. So I know that I've got all my engine and transmission bolts out, and I know that this engine's ready to get pulled here. So what I'm going to do is leave that bolt where it's at right now and go ahead and set up my cherry picker, and we're going to go ahead and pluck this thing out of here.